Hello and welcome. Let me start by asking you something. How well do you think you know yourself? Now, you probably think that you know yourself pretty well. Most of us think that we do. You know your physical characteristics, your height, the colour of your eyes, your shoe size, your cholesterol level. Some of us are even very much aware, and maybe too much aware, of things like our age and maybe even our weight. We're also likely to be aware, at least to some extent, of our behaviours, our habits, how we react and behave in certain circumstances, our preferences, likes and dislikes, our attitudes towards certain things, and so on. Despite all this, I'm going to suggest that most of us don't know ourselves very well at all. In fact, I think that most of us are strangers to ourselves. What we've just spoken about are really the more observable characteristics of ourselves and the people around us. Those things that can be more easily seen, heard, felt, etc. I like to refer to these as the what. So putting the physical characteristics aside, let me ask you this. Do you know why? Do you know the reasons for those more easily identifiable traits? Do you know why you think the way that you do? Why some things are more important to you than others? Why you notice some things and not others? In your mind, what determines what is right or wrong, good or bad, polite or rude, acceptable or not acceptable? In other words, do you know why you believe what you believe? I think this is a very fascinating question, but it wasn't until relatively recently that I even thought of asking it. Let me tell you how I got to this point. I spent most of my working life in international business roles, conducting business with people all around the world. So I have a lot of experience interacting with people from different cultures. I observed many differences that extended far beyond just the language. But I didn't ask why. Why? Because I already knew. At least I thought I did. I worked it out all by myself, without going to too much trouble at all. I interpreted the behaviours of others on what I knew about what those behaviours meant, and an assumption that the meanings that I attributed to those different behaviours are universal. I have to admit, I was wrong. For example, in a face-to-face conversation, when the other person avoided eye contact with me, it meant that they were lying. There was no question in my mind that that was the reason. I knew that from experience. But that experience was limited to what I had learnt from the environment that I was exposed to and the one that I knew, from the people who I shared that environment with. In other words, my culture. I assumed that the meaning of that behaviour was universal. It never occurred to me that another person from a different culture might attribute a different meaning to that same behaviour. So in this case, I made several mistakes. Mistake number one, I viewed the behaviour from my perspective rather than theirs. Mistake number two, I assumed that the meaning of that behaviour was the same for them as it was for me. And mistake number three, I attributed an intent and judged that person based on my interpretation of that behaviour. Now, to try and make myself feel better, I'm going to say that I'm not the only person that has made these mistakes, and I'm also going to suggest, which will make me feel even better still, that most of us make these mistakes constantly. So what was the real reason for the person not looking me in the eye when they spoke to me? I found out later that their intention was to show humility and respect. They wanted to show me that they acknowledged and respected the differences in status that they perceived existed between the two of us. In their minds, they were complimenting me by raising my status above theirs, and then showing me the level of respect deserving of that position. I thought they were lying, were being disrespectful. I judged them as being untrustworthy, virtually the opposite to their intention. How wrong can you be? The question is, do we know that we do this? Do we know ourselves well enough to identify that we think and react this way? I didn't. Self-awareness is the key to cultural understanding. After a while, I learnt that my interpretation of what I observe is really based on underlying assumptions that exposure to my culture has taught me. In other words, the things I take for granted that I don't even think of questioning. These assumptions determine how I see the world and how I think it should be. How I react is based on my interpretation, which is based on my values that are based on my assumptions. Therefore, if those assumptions are wrong, so is my interpretation and my reaction. We don't see things as they are, we see things as we are. Mark Twain sums it up nicely in this quote: "The trouble with this world is not that people know too little, but they know too much that ain't so."